I don't know about you, but as you educate yourself about power and influence, you're going to start seeing things in the marketplace that bother you. I want to share with you 2 simple strategies to address the anxiety that comes with knowing things that the public doesn't seem to understand. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations. Now, I've shared with you details about how to use public media to influence opinions and to influence outcomes. And by looking at that media and knowing that media can be an influential model, you may start noticing bias in both liberal and even what's being called right-wing media, conservative media, liberal media, whatever you call it. There's always bias. You're going to start noticing trigger points where a reporter wants to trigger an emotion in the person being interviewed to get a certain response. You'll notice loaded questions. You'll notice bias in setups and information. So, for example, a lot of reporters will ask questions, and then the very last question, when they're running out of time, they'll disclose, hey, we're almost out of time. You get the last word. They'll share the last word, and if it isn't along the narrative of the program, then the reporter themselves will go over the time, correcting the narrative. You're going to see all these things. You're going to recognize these things. And it's going to blow your mind that the general public doesn't see this. Now, understand, you have invested time and resources in understanding how the world is rather than how you'd like the world to be, because that's the way you get the greatest influence. The greatest influence comes understanding human behavior, understanding how people function, and understanding the cause and response activities that happen in our world. For example, if there's some outrageous tragedy, whether it's an earthquake or the murder of an individual or a crime or something that's been broadcast like the global pandemic, there will always be a opportunistic response. Okay? So there's going to be the regular response of people scared, people outraged, people frustrated. But there will always be this opportunistic response. Now, you're going to know about this because you've invested in the intelligence that comes with strategic relations. You've invested in understanding human behavior. But you have to understand, the general population has not. That's why I have 2 specific tips for you. First off, you will realize there's a high level of anxiety. I had a neighbor come to me and say, so I'm doing some environmental projects. And the neighbor came to me and said, there are too many frogs. The frogs singing at night are keeping him up all night. And second, I've created a lot of mosquitoes. He says, I've created mosquitoes because I have a detention pond that, after it was dug, filled up with water because we had flood events. Now, I know that mosquitoes don't live in deep water. First off, mosquitoes don't breathe underwater. They don't live in deep, murky, silt-filled water. That's just not what they do. Mosquitoes might live in tall grass, but they don't tend to live in tall grass that dries out. And mosquitoes can primarily live in basins where they can come up for air and water that has high nutritional content, so they have something to eat. So I know this stuff. Now, do I explain to this individual that no, we don't have an increased number of mosquitoes? In fact, we have much fewer mosquitoes, which is evidenced by this second part. Or do I just simply listen? Well, the best thing to do is simply listen, because it is frustrating for someone to have a fit at you because they don't understand some basic concepts. Because the second concept is, if you have an abundance of frogs, you tend to have a lot fewer mosquitoes. Just as if you have an abundance of birds, you're going to have fewer insects. It's just because the frog is the predator to the mosquito. Now, another factor is in place here too, is that larger bodies of water tend to have water beetles. They tend to have fish in them. All my ponds have fish in them. Those will eat out the mosquitoes, and the larvae are killed, the mosquitoes killed, you have fewer mosquitoes. Now, that's how I know there are fewer mosquitoes because of his own evidence. Now, this is all, I'm expanding this a little bit to demonstrate the logic that's probably going on in your head. You see violence in the street, you see peaceful protesters, and then you see rioters. The news, one channel shows you the peaceful protesters, the other channel shows you the rioters. You understand that they're not necessarily two of the same people. It's possible the protesters went home and the rioters came out. Explaining it to somebody is not going to convince them that you're right and they're wrong, because you're coming from a context of understanding systems, for example. I understand that mosquitoes breed in certain types of water. I treat that water with a compound that kills the mosquitoes, and I also create habitat for predators that eat mosquitoes. He doesn't know that. The neighbor doesn't know it. He might be dropping F-bombs. He might be complaining. He might be upset. He may even contact the city. But I cannot explain it to him in a very short period of time. First, when their emotions are high. Second, when they quite don't understand the environment. Now, what I can do is make a suggestion that if that is a concern, here's one way to test. So if he's concerned about mosquitoes, you can buy a mosquito trap and you can count the volume of mosquitoes captured in the mosquito trap. Now, some mosquito traps attract mosquitoes, and that's fine. He may get a larger than real population count, but he would be killing the mosquitoes that he is concerned about at the same time trying to prove me right or wrong. See, that's a better technique, is to set the person up to discover for themselves the right answer. Now, there are probably 10 or 15 different ways. You can do sticky traps and surveys and hire Virginia Tech to come out and do we're in Virginia to do a measure. You can do a lot of different things. But yelling at me, I recognize, is not the appropriate response for the situation. So my understanding is that there must be something else going on. Again, number one, just because you know something to be true, just because you understand the interactions between and the nuances between systems and people, doesn't mean you have to explain it to somebody. Okay? When you explain it to somebody who's emotionally enhanced and frustrated, and they may have 5 other problems that have nothing to do with you or nothing to do with the particular point of argument, there's no way to convince them. It's just not going to happen. They aren't thinking, they are emoting. So you simply step back, step 2, and understand what are test cases. If someone says to you there is systemic racism that has held back an entire population of people, you can simply ask, well, how do we know this is true? So a statement that, well, you're wrong because this, and this is actually going to just escalate the situation. But if you ask the question, you say that's interesting, which is a disarming response. That's interesting. What is the evidence? How do we know if this is true or this is not true? Now, if their response is simply because this is what I was told, or this is what so-and-so says, or they may say, well, that's just because that's the way it is, then we know they're not coming from a perspective of dialogue. They're coming from a perspective of maybe positioning, trying to be part of a crowd. They might be coming from a perspective of a deep-seated belief that is not supported by evidence. They might be in a position where they read it in a book somewhere, but the book intended to influence them to take certain behavior or a certain political position. Now, I'm not going to confirm or deny whether or not systemic racism exists, but I can tell you that with the understanding of strategic relations, it can be a case where we knew there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq because we sold them the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So we know that we sold weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, to Iraq prior to the point where there was a claim that they had chemical weapons. Now, we don't know that they had chemical weapons at the exact claim, and it rolled out later with trials and such that was questionable. But ultimately, what if, and this is a response, what if that systemic racism was created by the people who want you to believe that you've been oppressed? See, we're shifting the narrative through questions rather than setting the facts straight. There are enough books out there, there's enough evidence out there for any point of view, right or wrong. And if you start laying out the facts, I'm glad you said that because I want to lay out the facts to you. Oh, that's not what I heard. I want to show you the fact. That then becomes a conflict where you're against them and you two are trying to fight it out to figure out who's right or wrong. You know from your investment in strategic relations, critical thinking, and rational dialogue that it is possible that the case is true for a reason, and false for a reason. But in a, right there, you're not gonna get it fleshed out. Now, I've seen this exhibited in many ways. I saw a civil rights person get approached, and the guy was yelling in his face. This is a historical video. I don't have the name of the person right off the top of my head, but their response was, "Perhaps that is true. Let's sit down and have a dialogue about it." See, that's a great response. It's disarming. It is not confirming or denying the situation. In fact, it's even saying, well, you know what? That is possible. Your position is possible. That's really where people are coming from. They want confirmation. They want acknowledgement. Oh, that's possible. Let's sit down. And the action is let's sit down and have a dialogue about it. Now, two people standing on a street corner yelling at each other are not going to accomplish anything. But two people sitting down, even with an audience, and having a debate, quite possibly could influence a positive outcome that would not be available through other means. Now, why do people riot? Why do people go in the streets? Why do people protest? Well, very often you were not taught to move a concept forward in a positive way because it is not beneficial to political individuals to have rational thinking responses. Let me get this broken down for you. Second Amendment argument. Second Amendment was constructed for reasons X, Y, and Z. A political figure after a gun violence event, even if the gun violence event isn't statistically significant, it is significant to the individuals involved. The politician wants those individuals to vote for them in general, but specifically, they need a catalyst to get that attention, to get that vote. The front of mind catalyst is gun rights, Second Amendment, people's safety. Nobody's going to argue that people have the right to bear arms or not the right to bear arms. That's kind of that is a Freudian slip. I believe people have the right to bear arms, but it's not the right to bear arms. It's the right to self-defense, and weapons are one way to defend themselves. Intelligence is also another way, so they should also have the right to intelligence. But ultimately, that is a top-of-mind figure that the politician can use to get the attention of this specific group that has been emotionally impacted so that they can put support behind this particular law. And the political person doesn't really care whether the law goes through or not. It doesn't matter, because now they've got the attention of the individuals, and they can start offering them other perspectives to gain votes and support. Now, that's just a really offhand type of example, and it doesn't matter what you believe about gun rights, your right to self-defense, or the right of personal property. It is something that is used by both sides because it is a top-of-mind activity. It is an opportunity to move forward. Dialogue feels like you're moving forward. Now, dialogue is a great way to disarm, but it's also a great way to get insights to move forward, but it doesn't guarantee that everybody moves forward. But it also, if you can get the names of the people who are interested in a particular topic, you can always transition their interest into other topics that you've tied in with the original. So let me summarize this. There are two things. First off, if somebody comes to you and they have a position, you're not likely to move them from that position through argumentation, especially if they're emotionally attached to the statement or position that they have. It's also possible that you have invested in education, critical thinking, and other resources that have put you at an advantage, a significant advantage, to understand the broader picture and the influencing factors. But it's not your place to tell them. In fact, leaving them ignorant has more power because it gives you the opportunity to invite them into the step number 2, which is some kind of dialogue. Hey, I understand you're frustrated by the frogs. We live next to a creek. Whether or not I have ponds or anything like that, we're still going to have frogs. But let's understand that. I don't understand it. Let's understand it. Let's have a dialogue about that. I understand you're concerned about mosquitoes. Mosquitoes and frogs, they're predators. The frogs eat mosquitoes. Maybe there's a way to find a balance here. Tell me more about your situation. A lot of times what I found is in conflict situations is that if you get them talking, get the other person talking, you can tone down the language, because a lot of times when people are emotional, they get loud, they get profane, and you have to tone that down to make them more receptive to the possibility that, yes, they're right. There is X. However, the conditions that cause X are not quite what you're being told. There are problems with violence, but the conditions that cause violence aren't necessarily the conditions that you've been told. If you tell somebody that, they will not listen to you. But if you acknowledge that, yes, we've got a problem here, how do we fix it? How do we sit down and come up with a plan so that we can take action and get this fixed? You've now taken yourself from adversary to advocate, and you can help with that education. You can help with that expanding or broadening of perspectives, and ultimately move forward to the outcomes that you're looking for. I know this stuff sounds manipulative, and it is really, but it needs to be used for good. It needs to be used to improve people's freedoms, people's liberties, people's inalienable rights. And when you can do those things, it gives you tremendous power and resources. It gives you access to outcomes, and you do get the results that you're looking for. I'm Justin Hitt with Inside Strategic Relations, and this has been about how to address that anxiety that you're having right now because you see problems, you know what the solution is, you know what influences these problems, and you cannot figure out why these people are not moving towards a positive direction. Well, very often these people are simply puppets, and they're simply reacting, and it's theater. Now, in a whole different program, we'll talk about mental illness and we'll talk about other things, but ultimately, your rational thinking will not persuade them, especially when they're emotional. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions about this or anything else I cover, visit me at www.insidestrategicrelations. You don't need to be a paid subscriber to ask questions. And questions are the gateway to knowledge. So if you visit www.insidestrategicrelations, you can contact our offices with your questions, and I'll address those questions either here or on a podcast. And even if I produce something that's members only, I'll get you a copy of it because you had the courage to ask a question. Thanks for listening.